May 2, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI for 48 years, died in his sleep at age 77. Within hours, White House officials led by President Nixon's counsel, John Dean, rushed to Hoover's home. They weren't there to pay respects. They were there to find the files, the secret files, the blackmail files that Hoover had used to control every president since Franklin Roosevelt. But the files were gone. Someone had gotten there first and removed them. Decades of secrets, surveillance reports, wiretaps, photographs, evidence of affairs, corruption, communist connections. Everything Hoover had collected on the most powerful people in America had vanished. 3 presidents had tried to fire J. Edgar Hoover. Roosevelt considered it in 1943. Truman wanted him gone in 1945. Eisenhower explored options in 1953. All 3 changed their minds. All 3 kept Hoover in power for the rest of their presidencies. Why? Because Hoover had files on all of them. Personal files, damaging files, files that could destroy their presidencies if made public. But the most interesting case was Harry Truman. Because Truman hated Hoover more than any president before or after, he called him a son of a bitch in private conversations. He accused him of running a secret police force. He wanted to fire him on his first day as president, and yet Truman not only kept Hoover, he expanded the FBI's power and gave Hoover everything he wanted for 8 years. This isn't a story about law enforcement. This is about blackmail, about how one unelected bureaucrat accumulated enough dirt on America's leaders to make himself untouchable. And it is about why Harry Truman, the man who fired Douglas MacArthur and stood up to Stalin, couldn't fire a FBI director he despised. The story begins in April 1945, the day Truman became president. One of his first meetings was with J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover had been FBI director since 1924, serving under 5 presidents. He'd built the FBI from a small corrupt agency into a powerful national police force. He'd also built something else, a massive secret filing system containing damaging information on politicians, judges, journalists, and anyone else who might threaten his power. Hoover walked into that first meeting with Truman carrying a thick folder. He placed it on Truman's desk and said, "Mr. President, I thought you should see this. It is important for your security." Truman opened the folder and found a detailed dossier on himself. His financial history, his connection to the Pendergast political machine in Kansas City, his business failures, his wife Bess's family scandals, even allegations about his personal life that weren't true but would be damaging if leaked to the press. Truman read through the file, his face reddening with anger. When he finished, he looked at Hoover and asked, "Why are you showing me this?" Hoover's response was perfectly calculated. He said, "Mr. President, I want you to know that these files exist. I keep them secure, but if you ever decide you don't need the FBI's services anymore, I can't guarantee what might happen to them." It was a threat wrapped in courtesy. Hoover was telling Truman, "I have dirt on you, and if you fire me, it becomes public." Truman understood immediately. He'd dealt with political machines and corrupt bosses his entire career. He recognized a shakedown when he saw one. Truman's instinct was to fire Hoover on the spot. He told his aide, Harry Vaughan, later that day, "That son of a bitch just walked into the Oval Office and threatened the President of the United States. I should have him arrested." Vaughan asked why he didn't. Truman's answer revealed the trap he was in, because he'd released those files before the arrest warrant was signed. "And even if half of it is lies, the scandal would cripple my presidency before it starts." So Truman kept Hoover, but he immediately ordered his own investigation into how Hoover had accumulated so much power. What he discovered was shocking even by Washington standards. Hoover had been collecting secret files on politicians and public figures for over 20 years using illegal wiretaps, break-in surveillance, and informants. He kept these files separate from official FBI records in a system he called official and confidential files, stored in his office where no one else had access. The files contained everything, affairs, homosexual relationships, that could destroy careers in that era. Financial improprieties, Communist Party connections, real or fabricated, organized crime ties, anything that could be used as leverage, and Hoover used them ruthlessly. Congressmen who criticized the FBI found damaging leaks in the newspapers. Judges who ruled against FBI interests discovered old scandals suddenly becoming public. Journalists who investigated Hoover faced exposure of their personal lives. Truman also discovered that Hoover had extensive files on Franklin Roosevelt. Files about Roosevelt's relationship with his secretary Lucy Mercer, about his health problems that were hidden from the public, about decisions made during the war that could be portrayed as failures. Hoover had used these files to maintain his position under Roosevelt, and Roosevelt, like Truman, had chosen to keep Hoover rather than risk exposure. But Truman found something even more disturbing. Hoover had files on Eleanor Roosevelt, detailed surveillance reports about her friendships, her political activities, her correspondence, her travel. Some of the material suggested relationships that could have been scandalous if made public in the fines. Hoover had shown some of this material to Franklin Roosevelt as a demonstration of his reach and power. When Truman learned this, he was furious. Whatever his disagreements with Eleanor Roosevelt, he respected her public service. The idea that Hoover was blackmailing presidents by threatening to expose their families crossed a line even for hardened political operators like Truman. In June, Truman called a meeting with Attorney General Tom Clark, who was Hoover's nominal boss. Truman told Clark, "I want Hoover out. Find me a legal way to fire him that doesn't give him time to release his files." Clark investigated and came back with bad news. Hoover couldn't be fired without cause, and building a case against him would take months, during which Hoover could release anything he wanted. Even worse, Hoover had informants throughout the Justice Department who would warn him the moment firing proceedings began. Truman was trapped. He couldn't fire Hoover without triggering the release of damaging files. He couldn't build a case against Hoover without Hoover finding out and preemptively striking. And he couldn't ignore Hoover because the FBI director was accumulating more power every day. So Truman tried a different approach. He decided to contain Hoover, to limit his power while keeping him in place. In late Truman issued a directive requiring all FBI investigations of government officials to be reported to the White House. It was an attempt to prevent Hoover from conducting secret surveillance without presidential knowledge. Hoover's response was immediate. Within days, newspapers published stories about communist infiltration of the Truman administration, with quotes from FBI sources, suggesting Truman was soft on communism. The message was clear: if you try to control me, I'll destroy you politically. Truman backed down. He rescinded the directive and let Hoover operate independently. It was one of the few times in his presidency that Truman publicly retreated from a position, and it ate at him for years. But Hoover wasn't done demonstrating his power. In Fay, a White House aide named George Schoenman made the mistake of criticizing the FBI at a private dinner party. Someone at the dinner reported it to Hoover. Within a week, newspapers published stories about Schoenman's questionable associations and security risks in the White House. The stories were based on FBI files that Hoover leaked to friendly journalists. Schoenman was forced to resign to stop the scandal from spreading. Truman got the message. Anyone in his administration who criticized Hoover would be destroyed. Hoover had made himself untouchable by demonstrating he could ruin anyone who challenged him. The situation got worse in Fay with the beginning of the Cold War. Hoover positioned himself as America's defender against communist infiltration. He launched investigations into alleged communist sympathizers in government, entertainment, and education. Many of these investigations were legitimate, many were not. But Hoover used the communist threat as cover to expand his surveillance powers and his collection of blackmail material. Truman found himself dependent on Hoover for intelligence about Soviet espionage. The FBI was identifying real Soviet agents in the government information Truman needed, but Hoover mixed legitimate intelligence with political hit jobs, making it impossible to separate FBI counterintelligence from Hoover's personal vendettas. The breaking point almost came in Fay. Hoover's FBI had been investigating Alger Hiss, a State Department official accused of being a Soviet spy. Truman initially dismissed the case as a red herring, Believing it was politically motivated, he was partially right. Hoover was using the Hiss case to embarrass Truman's administration and prove the FBI's importance. But Hiss actually was a Soviet agent, and Truman's dismissal of the case made him look weak on communism. When evidence of Hiss's guilt became overwhelming, Truman was furious with Hoover for setting him up. He called Hoover to the White House and told him, "You made me look like a fool defending a communist spy. You knew he was guilty and you let me walk into that trap." Hoover's response was chilling. He said, "Mr. President, if you trusted the FBI's judgment from the beginning, you wouldn't be in this position. Perhaps you'll trust us more in the future." It was another threat. Hoover was telling Truman, "Don't question my investigations, or I'll make you look bad again." And Truman had no choice but to accept it, because firing Hoover after the Hiss case would look like retaliation for exposing communist espionage. The most dramatic confrontation came in Fay. Truman had reluctantly supported Hoover's investigations into alleged communists in government, even though he believed many were witch hunts. But when Senator Joseph McCarthy began his communist accusations, Hoover provided McCarthy with FBI files to fuel his investigations. Truman was appalled. McCarthy was destroying reputations based on rumor and guilt by association, and Hoover was enabling it. Truman called Hoover to the White House and demanded he stop giving files to McCarthy. Hoover refused, arguing that congressional oversight required FBI cooperation with Senate investigations. Truman said that was a lie, that Hoover was choosing to help McCarthy for political reasons. The meeting ended with both men furious. 2 days later, newspapers published stories about security risks in the Truman White House, with detailed allegations about various staff members. The stories were clearly based on FBI files. Hoover was retaliating for Truman's criticism by leaking damaging information about the president's own staff. Truman was livid, but he was also helpless. He couldn't prove Hoover had leaked the files. He couldn't fire Hoover without looking like he was covering up security risks. He was checkmated by a bureaucrat he despised. What made it worse was that Truman knew Hoover was right about some things. There were Soviet spies in the US government. The FBI was catching them. Truman needed Hoover's FBI to protect national security, even though Hoover was abusing his power for political purposes. It was an impossible situation. By Fay, Truman had accepted that he couldn't fire Hoover. Instead, he focused on surviving Hoover. He avoided confrontations. He let Hoover run the FBI independently. He gave Hoover budget increases and public praise. And in private, he seethed with resentment. Truman's personal diary from this period reveals his hatred of Hoover. In one entry from March Fay, he wrote, "Hoover is the most dangerous man in America. He has files on everyone and uses them like a gangster. He is blackmailing the government and there is nothing I can do about it. Roosevelt let him get too powerful, and now we're all paying for it." But Truman never made these feelings public. He continued to praise Hoover in speeches. He signed legislation expanding FBI powers. He gave Hoover everything he wanted, because the alternative, attempting to fire Hoover, was political suicide. The final indignity came in Fay, Truman's last year in office. Hoover's FBI investigated corruption in the Truman administration, a real problem that Truman was trying to address. But Hoover leaked the investigations to newspapers before Truman could take action, making it look like Truman was covering up corruption. It damaged Truman's reputation and helped Republicans in the Fay election. Truman wanted to fire Hoover before leaving office to make it Eisenhower's problem. But his advisers warned that firing Hoover during the transition would look like spite and would likely trigger Hoover to release damaging files about Truman's presidency. So Truman left office with Hoover still in power, having failed to remove the man he considered the most dangerous person in Washington. Years later, after leaving the presidency, Truman was asked why he never fired Hoover. His answer was revealing. "I wanted to, every day I wanted to, but Hoover had files on me, on my staff, on my family, on everyone. He'd spent 4 years collecting dirt on every politician in Washington. If I'd fired him, he would have released it all and destroyed not just me but everyone around me. So I kept him, and I hated every minute of it. Truman also reflected on what Hoover's power meant for democracy. We talk about checks and balances, about civilian control, about accountability. But what happens when one unelected official accumulates so much blackmail material that he can't be fired? Hoover proved that information is power, and he had more information than anyone, that made him more powerful than presidents. The tragedy is that Truman was right. Hoover remained FBI director until his death in Fay, serving under 8 presidents. Every single one of them considered firing him. None of them did. Roosevelt couldn't because he needed Hoover during the war. Truman couldn't because Hoover had too much dirt. Eisenhower couldn't because Hoover knew about his wartime affair. Kennedy couldn't because Hoover had files on his relationships. Johnson couldn't because Hoover had been collecting information on him for decades. Nixon couldn't because, well, Nixon had plenty to hide. When Hoover finally died, there was a race to find his secret files. They were never fully recovered. His longtime assistant Helen Gandy destroyed many of them. Others were hidden or lost, but enough survived to confirm what everyone had suspected. Hoover had been running a blackmail operation from the FBI director's office for nearly 4 years. The files that survived revealed surveillance on presidents, Supreme Court justices, congressmen, civil rights leaders, journalists, and thousands of ordinary citizens. They contained sexual information, financial records, political associations, anything that could be used as leverage. Hoover had built a surveillance state within the government and used it to make himself untouchable. Truman's failure to fire Hoover stands as one of the great missed opportunities of his presidency. He'd fired Douglas MacArthur, the most famous general in America, for insubordination. He'd stood up to Stalin and started the Cold War containment policy. He'd desegregated the military against fierce opposition. But he couldn't fire J. Edgar Hoover. Why? Because MacArthur didn't have files. Stalin couldn't ruin Truman's domestic political career. Military brass couldn't leak scandals to destroy the president. But Hoover could do all of that and more. He'd spent decades building an insurance policy that made him unfireable, and Truman, despite all his courage on other issues, didn't have the power to overcome it. The deeper lesson is about the danger of secret information in the hands of unaccountable officials. Hoover proved that surveillance plus blackmail equals power that even presidents can't challenge. He showed that democratic accountability breaks down when one person controls too many secrets. Truman understood this danger. In his retirement, he wrote about the need to reform the FBI, to limit the director's term, to prevent the accumulation of secret files. Many of his recommendations were eventually adopted after Hoover's death, and the Watergate scandal exposed FBI abuses. But it was too late for Truman and the other presidents who'd been trapped by Hoover's blackmail system. The final irony is that Hoover's files on Truman probably weren't that damaging. Truman had lived a relatively clean life compared to many politicians. His connection to the Pendergast machine was public knowledge. His financial struggles were well documented. The personal allegations in Hoover's files were likely exaggerated or false. But Hoover didn't need real scandals to control presidents. He just needed them to believe he had real scandals. The threat was as effective as the reality. And Truman, who'd survived machine politics in Kansas City and World War as president, fell for Hoover's bluff because he couldn't risk being wrong. That is why Harry Truman kept J. Edgar Hoover's blackmail files. Not because Hoover had devastating information, but because Hoover convinced him he did. And by the time Truman might have called Hoover's bluff, Hoover had demonstrated his willingness to destroy anyone who challenged him. In the end, Truman couldn't fire Hoover for the same reason Roosevelt couldn't, and Eisenhower couldn't, and Kennedy couldn't, because Hoover had made himself the most powerful man in Washington by knowing everyone's secrets, and even presidents bow to that kind of power.